Good morning, everyone. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Glad to see all of you here today. As Rabbi mentioned, today's Torah portion is called Korach. Last week, Pastor Darrell gave a wonderful message on last week's portion called Shalach, which tells the story of the sin of the spies and the failure of Israel to enter the Promised Land. This week's Parsha, Korach, tells us the story of the great political rebellion that was staged by Korah and his followers. Today, we're going to look at how these two Torah portions are connected to one another on a deeper level and explore the effects that one had on the other. We've seen the people of Israel approach Moses and Aaron before to complain, but never like this. What Korah and his followers attempt is nothing short of a coup. Look at his words to Moses and Aaron, and we heard it today as today's Torah reading. If you want to follow along, we're going to be going over number 16 today. We'll cover several passages throughout there. But number 16, verse 3 says, "You take too much upon yourselves, for all the congregation is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is in their midst. Why do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord?" At first glance, it may seem that Korah is a populist hero. He's speaking up for the holiness that resides in all people, making an attractive, almost democratic claim, suggesting that there is a problem with the hierarchy that's inherent to the Torah's leadership model, with Moses and Aaron, the Kohen Gadol, at the top, and everyone else below. You may even seem to be inclined to sympathize with Korah and his cause. But if you read on in the story, it's very clear that God does not sympathize with them. God sends a plague against the people who supported the rebellion, and ultimately Korah and his followers are swallowed up by the earth. God's wrath is so inflamed that Moses needs to advocate on behalf of the people and plead with God not to destroy Israel altogether. So it's clear that God is not pleased with Korah's rebellion. But to understand why, you must read deeper into the scripture. Let's start with Moshe's words. Moshe seems suspicious of the claims right from the start, because he responds to Korah in verse 9, "Is it not enough that the God of Israel has distinguished you from the congregation of Israel, to draw you near to him, to perform the service in the tabernacle of the Lord, and to stand before the congregation and serve them? He drew you near, and all your brothers, the sons of Levi, with you, and now you seek the priesthood as well?" To understand where Moses is coming from here, you have to recall Korah's lineage. He's actually Moses and Aaron's first cousin, a member of the tribe of Levi, from the family of Kohath. While not the primary leader of the nation like Moses, and not the high priest like Aaron, Korah enjoys an illustrious position in his own right. The Levites, especially the sons of Kohath, were set aside and gifted the responsibility of caring for the tabernacle. The sages even tell us that Korah was personally entrusted in carrying the holy ark on his shoulders when the nation would travel. Needless to say, Korah held a pretty high position within the children of Israel. So Moses seems to be saying to Korah, "You say that you want to do away with the hierarchy, but perhaps you're not being totally honest. Perhaps what you really want to satisfy is becoming the high priest yourself. The only reason you don't like the hierarchy is that you aren't at the very top." At least that's one possibility. So what did Korah really want? Was there a difference between what he said and what he was truly trying to accomplish? And another question: what made him suddenly stand up and try and overthrow Moses and Aaron in the first place? A guy just doesn't wake up in the morning and decide to launch a rebellion. It's got to come from somewhere, there must be a motivation. There's got to be a story here somewhere. So why did Korah rebel? What really led to his rebellion? Korah mounts a challenge to the leadership of Moshe and Aaron, and our Parsha today tells us that story. The overriding question of the story is why, of all times, does Korah's rebellion happen right now? And why does it even have to happen at all? What exactly is Korah's issue with Moshe and Aaron? We might get a clue to all of this from an unlikely source. Every once in a while, names in Scripture have significance. In the book of Samuel, for example, a king named Nachash attacks Saul, the very first king of Israel. Can it be a coincidence that his name just happens to mean snake? There's certainly something snake-like about his attack. So I ask you this. Was there something Korah-like about Korah's rebellion? What would the name of Korah mean if it were a word? As it turns out, Kuf, Resh, Chet in the biblical Hebrew actually refers to an ancient Amorite mourning practice, a way of expressing grief. Karka means a bald spot, where you would intentionally tear out the hair on your head in the center of your forehead as a way of expressing grief. The Torah prohibits this in Deuteronomy 14, verse 1. And if you want to follow along, we'll be jumping back and forth between Deuteronomy and Numbers here. But what it says is, you are the children of the Lord your God. Do not create these bald spots on your heads for the dead. Now you might be asking yourself, what does an ancient Amorite mourning practice have to do with Korah's rebellion? Well, if we keep reading on in Deuteronomy 14, we'll find that the karka is not just a bald spot. It reminds us that Korah is everything else in the passage as well. Deuteronomy 14 outlines many prohibitions. So let's go back to Korah for a minute. What was the argument that Korah lodged against the leadership of Moshe and Aaron? Basically, he's saying, this leadership thing is too much for you. The entire congregation is holy, not just you, and God is with them. So Korah here seems to refer to the holiness of the community. But here's the strange thing. So does Deuteronomy 14. Right after it talks about the karka in verse 1, it says this in verse 2. For you are a holy people unto the Lord your God. And that's not it. Right after Korah references the holiness of the people, he says, why have you raised yourself up over the people? It turns out we have a very similar idea in Deuteronomy 14 as well. Right after the talk about the karka, the bald spot, and the holiness of the nation, it says, and the Lord has chosen you from among the nations who are on the face of the earth. Again, we have a concept of one selected from among many. It's very similar between the verses in Numbers and in Deuteronomy. The Torah seems to be saying, if you want to understand Korah, you've got to understand an ancient Amorite mourning practice. What does Korah, of all things, have to do with grief? Let me chart a little theory here for you that has to do with the question we asked about earlier. What was the motivation behind Korah's rebellion? If you look carefully, I think you'll find that there were several different layers to his motivation. Let's read some text here, and I'll show you what I mean. The first layer are Korah's overt words. He says, the entire nation is holy. Why do you exalt yourselves over them like this? Now, if I had to summarize that argument for you, I could do it in one word: communism, or maybe socialism. We are all equal. We are all holy. We don't need any leaders. But if you keep reading, the text begins to tell you another story. Moshe hears what Korah says, falls on his face, and replies, "Was it too little for you, Korah, that as a Levite, God set you aside in your tribe to be close to him and to serve in the tabernacle? Was that too little for you that you also want the priesthood?" Okay, so that was Moshe's retort. But I'll tell you something. If I'm Korah and I'm listening to that, my response would have been, "Moshe, did you not hear what I said? I'm not interested in being the leader myself. My whole point is there should be no leader." But interestingly, Korah doesn't say that. He appears to accept Moshe's premise. And why does he accept that? Well, he wouldn't unless at some level Moshe got his motivation right. Evidently, Moshe heard something in Korah's words that were a little deeper than what Korah said overtly. Overtly, he said there shouldn't be any leader. But covertly, he said, maybe I should be the leader. It's like George Orwell back in Animal Farm. All animals are created equal, but some animals are more equal than others. In this example, communism is the veneer, but power is the goal. Except that if you listen a little bit more closely and you keep on reading, you'll find even a deeper layer of motivation here, one that saturates the words of Korah and his followers. And it's here that we get the idea of grief and mourning. Now we go from Korah to Datan and Abiram and listen to Moshe's next dialogue with Korah's prime followers. Moshe calls to these men and asks them to come to him, but they answer, "We will not come up to meet you. Was it not enough for you that you brought us out of a land flowing with milk and honey, out of Egypt, to kill us here in this desert? That you also want to rule over us like this? We will not come up to meet you." Listen to that word, "come up." It's the first thing they say. We're not coming up to meet you. And it's also the last thing they say. We are not coming up to meet you. Why? Because they are saying, "You have failed us, Moses. What was your central promise to us? That you would bring us to a land of milk and honey." But the opposite of that has happened, hasn't it? Egypt, that was the land of milk and honey for them. This is just a barren desert. And this is where we are all going to die. Moses is the one who said to Korah, "Is it not enough for you, Levi, that you also want to be a priest?" But here, Korah's followers, Datan and Abiram, are saying, "Was it not enough for you, Moses, that you took us out of a land flowing with milk and honey to die here?" They are viciously angry. And if you must characterize their motivation here, their motivation is not communism or socialism. Their motivation is not even power for themselves. It's just rage at Moses and Aaron for having brought them here to the desert to die. This isn't the first time that the people have complained in the desert about being brought there to die. But the difference is that this time it's real. You see, the people had always talked about their fear that they might die in the desert. In the sin of the spies, just before today's portion, they talked about their fear that they would die trying to conquer the promised land. That lack of faith in God had been the last straw. The people rejected God's willingness to go before them and help conquer the land. So in turn, God decreed that the entire generation currently living would all die in the desert over the next 40 years. None of them would get to see the land of Israel. That was Parsha Shalach, the sin of the spies. Now, here we are in Parsha Korach which takes place right after that. Wouldn't we need to understand today's Parsha in that context? When today's Parsha begins, they have just been told that they are all going to die in the desert, never seeing the promised land. That brings us back to Datan and Abiram. If you take a people who had expected to go into the promised land, and now suddenly it's not a journey of a few days, now it's a journey of 40 years until every one of them dies. They would be grieving, wouldn't they? The text actually seems to point us in that direction because it tells us right after the sin of the spies that the people were mourning. Numbers 14 tells us the people mourned greatly. But what form did that grief take? Initially, the scripture tells us denial. Right after the people grieved, the text tells us they rose up in the morning and they went up to the top of the mountain saying, "Here we are. We will go up to the place that God has promised us, for we have sinned." The people, in essence, are saying, God's decree, it wasn't real, right? But Moses is saying, no, it's real. You can't do that. Don't go up and attack them because God won't be with you. You will get decimated. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. They were all decimated. They were repelled by the inhabitants of Canaan. That was the first response to mourning. But what's the next stage? Once denial doesn't work anymore, the next stage is anger. How could this happen to me? Sometimes that anger is controlled, but sometimes it can get out of hand. And that's exactly this week's Parsha. The same word that was used for denial, the first stage of grief, here we are, we will go up, now becomes transmuted into anger in the mouths of Korah's followers. Now they're saying, we will not go up. They're not just saying, we will not go up to you, Moses. They're saying that we've come to grips with the truth. We now understand that we're not going up to the land. Therefore, we are angry at everything. We finally understand we're going to die here in this desert, and it's all your fault. But was it Moshe's fault, really? No. But that's the way blind rage works. And that's what Deuteronomy 14, the Karka, was talking about too. Don't tear your hair out when you mourn. Don't mutilate your body. There's an impulse that can turn mourning into rage. And that rage can turn one against oneself. When an individual attacks himself, they are essentially attacking their head, the leader of their body. For example, here, by tearing out their hair. When a community mourns the loss of itself, as was the case here, it attacks the head as well. Moshe and Aaron were the head that was being attacked by Korah's rebellion. When you tear the hair out of your head, it's a way of punishing yourself. And the Torah says, don't do that. It's pagan. It's an Amorite custom. Don't allow blind rage to come back and destroy you. You are the children of God, and you are better than that. The Torah, through the connections between Korah and Karka, tells us about the deepest levels of motivation behind Korah's rebellion. Grief that became communally self-destructive. In Deuteronomy 14, the prohibition against putting the Karka, that bald spot in your head, as a mark of mourning, is paired with another mourning practice. Don't slash yourselves in mourning, which is another form of self-mutilation. But the sages had a very strange way of interpreting this. They said not only does it teach you not to self-mutilate in mourning, it also teaches you something else. You shouldn't make yourselves into small little groups. At face value, you may look and you might say, what does a morning practice of slashing yourself have to do with not making yourself into small little groups? The sages saw something. There's a link between Karha, the bald spot, and Korah. And the sages extended that link into the slashing as well. Yes, Korah was grieving. He was attacking the head. But what was the effect of attacking the head? He was dividing the community against itself. And the sages say, don't do that. Don't slash yourself and don't tear your community apart. So when you read Deuteronomy 14, the simple meaning of the text refers to individual mourning practices, making this bald spot, slashing yourself. But the larger meaning of the text refers to communal mourning for communal loss. And that's the theme of the Parsha today. The Torah is warning us here about a deep human tendency buried in our soul. And as the praise and worship team starts to come forward, I'll leave you with this thought today. The true tragedy of Parsha Korach comes out of grief and despair. Korah's rebellion was not fueled by anger. It was fueled by grief. Korah wasn't angry at Moses. He was grieving. The people of Israel grieved because they now understood that because of their lack of faith, they were doomed to die in the desert, never getting to see the promised land. In failing to commit to God and go forward into the land, and now unable to go back to the land of Egypt, they were fated to wander in the desert for the rest of their lives. The last words of this generation are, behold, we perish. We are lost. We are all lost. And that's it. That's how the story ends. There's no redemption for Israel but to let go and acknowledge their fate. They are in a nightmare of their own making. They are grieving, and this generation will die out entirely, never realizing God's promise to them. But there's also a lot to learn from that first generation in the desert. They struggle with something that we too struggle with on a regular basis. We say that we trust God, but do we really believe it? Can we really cede control and admit that it's all in His hands? And it's not a question with an easy answer. It's something that we struggle and work with every single day. And as we do, perhaps we can look to these stories, the stories of Israel's struggle with this very same thing, and redeem the mistakes made by our ancestors. The Torah tells us to stay away from that kind of grief and resist at all costs the tragedy of Korach. So as we close today, if there's anyone here dealing with grief and despair, or anyone that needs to stand in the gap for someone who is in need of prayer, please come down to the front and one of our elders will pray over you. And if you just want to come down and worship openly, please do that as well. But let's all stand for this last song while Rabbi leads us.